So today we're going to focus on probably, I would say, is one of my favorite topics, and that's the idea of asking good questions. If you look at some of the literature, there are those that would say we've lost the art of asking questions. We are often more focused on answers and solutions than taking the time to step back and actually learn more about what it is we're facing, but want to move quickly to taking action and solving problems as they show up. And so in this context, I really want to frame this idea of questions as tools. Now, what do tools do? Tools do work. So if you're like me, when Saturday comes around, I wake up in the morning and I'm looking at my to-do list. What do I need to do today? And as the screen will show, if what I need to do is work in the garden, I will go to my garage and I will put together a bunch of tools that will support me to do the work that I need to do. If I'm going to be doing a carpentry project, then I will gather a different set of tools. If I'm going to be doing, something around plumbing, which I really don't like to do, but if I'm doing that, then I will gather tools there. And so I'll be very selective in identifying what's the type of work that I'm trying to engage and what are the tools that I can access that will support me to effectively do that work. So in our context, we're going to look at tools in service of work, and that primary work that we're focusing on is shared learning. Questions are tools that will really support the framing and the construction of conversations that will support us to do shared learning. So as we go forward, I want you to be thinking about questions, tools in service of how do I work collectively in relationship with others to participate in shared learning, to engage challenging situations that we jointly face. So before we get into specifics about questions and specific types of questions, I want to take some time to explore a bit of the landscape, I might call it, that in which we are using those questions to do the work in which we're engaged. So with that, there we go. What's the nature of the work that we're doing? As I said, again, the nature of the work is shared learning. And there's a couple of models out there that sort of differentiate between the different types of shared learning or work that we may need to do around shared learning. There's one model that differentiates between, and often our shared learning, let me back up for a moment, is in service of solving a problem or reaching an agreement of some sort, okay? And so one model says, well, what's the difference between, say, solving a simple problem, a complicated problem, or a complex problem? And how would that inform the kinds of questions we might ask? So a simple problem, and the author of this particular model gives an example. A simple problem, he said, would be like baking a cake. Now, I don't want to offend anybody who happens to be an outstanding baker. I'm not. So if I want to bake a cake, it's a fairly simple problem, because the question I'm going to ask is, what are the ingredients I need? What is the recipe I'm going to use? Do we have a cake mix in the pantry that I'm going to pull out? I mean, very simple kind of thing. And so it doesn't require a lot of new learning. It requires learning what do we have access to that we can use. A complicated problem is like a simple problem, but just more complicated, which is not always helpful. So the author differentiates between baking a cake and, say, building a rocket. Now, what differentiates building a rocket from making a cake is it's more complicated. But what makes it the same is if you and I come together and we do all the work and we ask all the right questions and we get the information, if we build a rocket, if we launch it and it's successful, if we build another one like it, it's going to be successful. So it's more complicated, but it's still, we can come together, we can access what we know and put it together to make a rocket. Now, in this particular model, when we get to a complex problem, I had to laugh when I was looking at the example or reading the example of the author. He said, a complex problem, the author said, is like raising children. Now, I'm guessing that all of you who are on this call have children. And so, you may be chuckling at this at some point. Basically, I have an adult son and an adult daughter. And what my wife and I learned is that everything that we learned raising our son was, for the most part, not useful in raising our daughter. Other than unconditional love, it was a whole new learning curve. As a complex challenge, it required new learning, okay? A complex challenge says, we're facing something for which our existing knowledge and information isn't enough. We're going to have to come together and leverage what we know individually, our individual experiences and expertise, and apply that to this uniquely new challenge. Now, I don't know about you, but that basically sounds like special education, IDEA, individualized education plan, specially designed instruction, okay? So questions are in service of the shared learning necessary for you and I to engage the nature of the problem, whether it's a simple problem, a complicated problem, or a complex problem. Those contexts will require different kinds of questions. Another author, Ronald Heifetz, who teaches at Harvard, differentiates in this way, technical work versus adaptive work. And what the author would say is that when we're doing technical work, we're solving problems to which we already have the answer, or we already have multiple answers. And so the real work that's required is to figure out what's the answer that best fits our situation. Adaptive work is where you and I don't know what we need to know to engage the challenge. We don't have within us individually or even collectively the knowledge or the experience or the orientation to the work that we need to take on. It's going to require you and I to engage in new learning to engage that challenge. I would say the fundamental function of an IEP team is to do adaptive work. Now, in reality, there are certain elements of the IEP process that are technical work, and it's in the documents that we fill. I mean, we check the boxes and we answer the questions. But the core function of an IEP team is to adaptive work, which is how can we take what we know individually? How do we structure a conversation that will allow you and I to share what we know individually, and so we can apply it collectively to this unique challenge that we're facing as we're looking to identify and define a free and appropriate public education, which includes special design instructions and accommodations and all that kind of thing. So recognizing that questions in service of shared learning, the type and complexity of that learning will require different kinds of questions. The role being, how do we expand our proverbial toolbox, so to speak, for that kind of learning going forward, okay? So where do we engage problems and challenges collectively? We engage them in the context of a conversation. Where do we ask questions in support of shared learning? We ask them in the context of conversations. And it's been said that the conversations you and I have are driven by the questions we ask. And fundamentally, if you want to change the structure of a conversation, if you want to change what's possible in a conversation, if you want to change the potential outcomes of a conversation, you want to ask a different question. And so as we engage collectively to do the work that we're doing in the context of conversations, the proverbial toolbox that we have of questions to do that work becomes pretty essential. And as we move towards the end here, I'll be introducing you to that. But the idea here is that every conversation we have has a structure to it. You know, my role as a mediator and a facilitator is to change the structure of people's conversations. And my role as a coach is to structure a conversation that facilitates, shared learning and insight. And again, much of that is based on the kinds of questions I ask as a mediator, as a facilitator, as a husband, as a father, as a member of various communities, whether they're geographic communities or faith communities. Every conversation has a structure. And now, what do I mean by, have you ever been in a conversation, for example, where nobody tells you this, but as you enter into the conversation, you draw the conclusion that there's probably things you shouldn't say. Now, nobody told you that, but you get a sense from the structure of the conversation that I don't think I should ask certain questions here. I don't think I should share certain perspectives here. Now, in that kind of conversation, that limits our ability to engage shared learning. If people are afraid to ask questions, afraid to share diverse opinions and explore them collectively, our ability as a group is seriously compromised to do the work that we need to do. So we're going to talk a bit about conversational structures because, again, I don't want to talk about questions out of context. I want to talk about questions in the context of how they influence and support the structures of our conversations. Now, in our culture, we often approach conversations, particularly difficult conversations where there are strongly held differences of opinion, high emotions, and high stakes issues, with the idea, I want to tell people what I think they need to know. I want to share my opinion and my perspective because I happen to believe that I'm right. And therefore, I'm going to share this information with you. And so typically I don't often go into the conversation with, what do I want to learn? I often go into the conversation with the idea of, what do I need to share with these people? And what do I want to share with them in a way that will, in essence, influence or help them change their point of view, or change their point of view to agreeing with me? And so again, the questions we ask and how we ask them will determine the structure of those conversations. Now, I'm going to introduce you to two models or frameworks that come from the literature about that sort of talk about this idea of conversational structure. There's a book called Difficult Conversations out there by Stone, Patton, and Heen. And they say that whenever you enter into a difficult conversation, you're most likely going to enter that conversation with one of two types of stances, is the term they use. Another way of saying that would be, you enter the conversation as showing up in a certain way, okay? One way we show up in the conversation is in what they call a telling stance. And again, the telling stance is typically driven by the context or the paradigm that says, you and I have a different point of view on this issue. We can't both be right. And I happen to think that I'm right. Therefore, you must be wrong. And that's a very strong paradigm in our culture. And therefore, I want to structure the conversation to tell you how wrong you are and how right I am in order to convert you to seeing things my way. So when I come into the conversation with that frame of mind, I'm really not focused on a lot of questions. I don't really want to hear about what you think because I've already determined that it's wrong. So why would I want to know what you think? So when I'm coming from a telling stance, I've come from a point of judgment. I've judged your perspective, it's wrong. Or if it's not wrong, it's flawed, it's not very well thought out. Often when I'm coming from a telling stance, I come with a certain amount of hubris. Now I had to look that word up because it's not one that I use all that often, but hubris is arrogance. And when I'm in a telling stance, there's really a sense that, hey, if you just knew what I knew, if you had my experience, my expertise, my knowledge, whatever, you would know, okay? And having been an educator, we can sometimes come across that way, I know. A certain amount of pretense, posturing going on. And finally, I want to make a distinction here. I am not saying that when you are entering into a difficult conversation, entering into a negotiation, a problem-solving perspective, I am not saying that you shouldn't tell people what you think, because we need to tell each other our thoughts, our ideas, our perspectives so that we can collectively learn together. What I am saying is a telling stance is what's the problem. It's dismissive. A telling stance says there's really only value in one person's point of view, that's mine. And therefore we're going to dismiss your point of view, your perspective, your expertise, because as far as I'm concerned, it's irrelevant or not helpful in any way. So the shift, what we want to make is I want to shift. Now, this is not just shift in what you're doing. It is a shift in how you show up in the conversation. In the telling stance, I'm showing up in the conversation to persuade, convince, coerce, convert you to seeing things my way. The alternative stance is I'm entering in the conversation with the fundamental objective of learning with you. Some of you are familiar with the book Crucial Conversations. And in the book Crucial Conversations, they say that whenever you enter into a difficult or challenging conversation, you come to the conversation or you bring to the conversation what the authors refer to as your personal pool of understanding. And my personal pool of understanding is everything that's informing me about what it is we're talking about. Everything from my ethnic background, my family of origin, my cultural orientation, my spiritual orientation, my gender, my education, everything. And you're coming from your personal pool of understanding. And what the authors say is that in those types of conversations, you and I are always, not sometimes, always operating from different pools of understanding, okay? I've been married coming up in 45 years this year, and my wife and I knew each other in high school, and it still amazes me how different our pools of understanding are on certain topics, as long as we've known each other, okay? Now, in a telling stance, you and I would argue whose pool of understanding is the one we're going to operate from. A learning conversation says, no, 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 no. The purpose of the conversation is to take our individual pools and merge them so as to create a deeper shared pool of understanding. Now, I love that metaphor because that's the function of the conversation, is to create deeper shared pools of understanding out of which you and I can reach agreements to move forward. Now, in that deeper shared pool of understanding, it does not mean that somehow at the end of the conversation, you and I are in common agreement on everything. What it does typically mean is at the end of the conversation, you and I will probably, most likely, almost always find things about which we agree. We will also find things about which we are uncertain. You know, I thought I was sure, and I'm not so sure anymore. I need to think about that. And finally, we may find things about which you and I will never agree, which is okay, just the way it is, okay? And there's things my wife and I will never agree on after almost 50 years of knowing each other. However, we now have a context of greater knowledge. We've increased our collective intelligence, you could say, by creating that deeper shared pool of understanding. So when you come from a learning stance, you're coming with curiosity. You write that word down, underline it, circle, highlight it, whatever. Curiosity. And one of my favorite quotes that I heard from an instructor in a class years ago is, I want to shift my relationship to the conversation from judgment and fear to curiosity and compassion. When I'm coming from judgment and fear, I'm feeling threatened, and therefore I'm going to be typically engaging in a telling stance. If I can shift from judgment and fear to curiosity and compassion or respect or kindness, I can be open for learning, okay? Which says I'm going to come with curiosity. I'm going to come with a certain amount of humility, which says I may know a whole lot about what we're talking about, but I don't know what you know. And if, in fact, if I knew what you knew, I would know a whole lot more that would be valuable, whether I agree with it or not. It's about truly being present in the conversation. If you're like me, you've been in conversations where people are saying they're physically there, but they're not there. Their eyes are focused on you, but behind their eyes, they're someplace else, okay? And finally, a learning stance invites us to acknowledge what we say we believe, that there's value in diversity of opinion. And that's a core value that we often espouse as teams and groups. We respect and value diversity of opinion. The creation of an IEP team was built on that principle, that there's value in diversity of opinion to do the complex work that we're doing as an IEP team. However, we often value diversity of opinion only until it shows up. And then we begin to debate who's right and who's wrong, rather than being able to hold off of the tension between divergent ideas and perspective and to be open to the learning there. A number of authors would say, where does all new learning occur? It's in the context of conflict. The idea of conflicting ideas, which moves us outside of our comfort zone. Now, how do we create those? How do we move outside our comfort zone? We ask questions. We ask questions that invite inquiry into new areas, to open up new places for exploration that we don't already know in order to move forward. So one model is, as I'm entering in the conversation, am I entering with a telling stance or a learning stance? If I'm entering it with a telling stance, I'm probably not interested in asking a lot of questions. If I'm entering it from a learning stance, I have a bunch of questions I want to ask. I come into the conversation with a whole bunch of questions in my pocket that I want to use, not to prove that you're wrong, but to explore this context that you and I are working in and in order to move forward. And Rob, if there's any questions that show up, or if you need to, give me a wave or something, I can stop at any time. So and answer that. So another model for looking at conversations comes from a book called Dialogue and the Art of Thinking Together. And in this book, the author takes a conversation and he creates a flow chart of an unfolding conversation. And in that sort of flow chart, he identifies what he calls choice points. And he says, in conversations, we enter points where we make a choice. And the choices we make in the context of that conversation will impact and influence the ongoing subsequent structure of that conversation. So again, to become effective in structuring conversations for shared learning, it's becoming conscious of where are those points in the conversation where I can influence the conversation to support and facilitate shared learning, and in essence, ask questions that will pursue, joint inquiry. So you and I are having a conversation, and we're having a difficult or challenging conversation. It's a conversation where you and I have some potentially strongly held differences of opinion. And so in the context of that conversation, the author says that you and I engage in deliberation. Now, to deliberate means just to weigh out, which means I'm just thinking about what you're saying in relationship to what I'm saying and what I think. I'm analyzing, I'm synthesizing, I'm reflecting on what's being said, sort of trying to make meaning out of this. And in the context of that deliberation, you and I enter what he calls a choice point. And depending on what we do at this choice point, it will have a significant impact on our subsequent conversation. So it becomes very important that we become cognizant of, aware of when we're in this choice point, so that we will make choices that are in alignment with our commitment for shared learning. Now, the author says we're going to make one of two choices. One is to suspend judgment. Now, suspending judgment, what does that mean? Suspending judgment doesn't mean you don't make a judgment. Suspending judgment says, I am beginning to make a judgment about you. I don't think you know what you're talking about. I don't think you've thought this through very clearly. I really think you're way out of your depth here, okay? So that's a judgment. And yet I say, I don't want to go there yet. I'm jumping to some conclusions. I'm making some assumptions here. I need to slow things down a little bit. So in essence, to suspend judgment is to sort of disidentify with that and say, yes, and I'm not going there. I'm basically going to not go there, all right? The second choice that we're going to make is pretty simple, is to defend myself. I don't like what you're saying. I don't know how you're saying it. I'm feeling threatened by you. You're kind of ticking me off. And so I'm feeling the need to defend myself. Now, in our culture and in the literature would say is we have a very strong propensity to go to defend. And it's one that's become increasingly challenging in our culture, in that we take complex issues and then we take positions on those issues and then we defend those positions. And what do we know about a good defense? A good defense is a good offense, which means I defend my position by attacking your position, which isn't about new learning, okay? So the choice we make there will influence the conversation. If we allow ourselves to proceed from a position of I'm feeling threatened by you, then we're probably going to have one of two types of conversations, which means we enter a second choice point. We're going to have what the author refers to as a controlled discussion, or we're going to have what he calls a skillful conversation. So what does he mean by that? A controlled discussion basically is a debate. What's the outcome of a debate? Well, there's a prevailing party. One of us wins, one of us loses. And so, in a formal debate, whether it's in an academic context or say a legal context, there's rules and structures to the debate. But you and I aren't having a formal debate. We're going to have what I like to refer to as an informal street brawl debate, which means one of us is going to win, one of us is going to lose. No rules, it's just take it on. And for many people who find challenging conversations and conflict aversive, it's because of those conversations. Yeah, I had the conversation and I got crucified. I got beat up really bad. I don't have those kinds of debates. I avoid those, okay? And so that's what a lot of people experience as we engage difficult, challenging issues, okay? We can have what he calls a skillful conversation, which he describes as dialectic, which is a fancy term for sort of a philosophical argument, looking at the differences between opposing truths or points of view. The point here is that most of the conversation is focused on advocating your point of view and pointing out the flaws in the other person's point of view, okay? And so in essence, it doesn't really support a lot of new learning. It's still focused on, your perspective versus my perspective, which doesn't unlock the conversation into exploring outside of either of our perspectives. We're kind of stuck there. So if we go back to that first choice point, we need to recognize that I have a choice here. Now, to the extent that you find yourselves in that defend mode and you're going, don't want to be down here, how do you move to the suspend mode? You ask a question. You ask a question of curiosity that moves you from defending your point of view to inquiring into more deeply understanding the other person's point of view. Hence the questions that we ask at those choice points will determine what's possible in the conversation. If we suspend judgment, if we're asking questions and open to new learning, we're engaged in what we call reflective dialogue or dialogue. Dialogue as a conversational structure is only about shared learning. It's about how do you and I sit down and talk to each other and walk away from the conversation going, whoa, I got a lot to think about. There's a lot of things I hadn't considered. You've really opened up my thinking about this. And we've done that, reciprocally, okay? And from that reflective dialogue, which is another way of saying from that deeper shared pool of understanding, we look at generative dialogue, which says, does this inform some action we might take? When might we generate some ideas, actions, decisions that allow us to move forward, okay? So again, I'm sharing these conversational structures because of the importance of the questions that we ask in determining the structure of those conversations. Telling conversation doesn't have a lot of questions. Defending conversations does not have a lot of questions. Dialogue, suspending judgment, learning, those are where questions come in. And those are the conversations that are essential to the complex work that we're doing as we're making decisions jointly on how to best serve the needs of our children and our youth, okay? So, questions on that? I don't know if that makes sense or not. So I want to share one more model with you, and then we're going to begin moving towards questions. And this is a model of negotiation. And negotiation is a fancy term for problem solving, shared decision making. It's a model that came in my book a number of years ago called Getting to Yes by Fisher and Urey. It's a model for how do you come together with someone else and negotiate, problem solve some shared issue. How do we reach an issue around, how do we reach agreements on issues around which you and I share a stake in the outcome? Now, it was originally written sort of as a negotiations framework, but this model has ramifications, and I'll tell you every dimension of your life, okay? And it's a model, when it was introduced, that fundamentally changed the way we think about how do you come together and jointly problem solve with other people in a way that doesn't result in a win-lose, but the classic win-win, or what we say will create mutual gain or mutual benefit. How do we have a conversation where one of us doesn't walk away going, well, I didn't get what I needed, and the other person goes, I won? How do we walk away from the conversation going, whoa, that was helpful. In fact, that was beneficial for both of us having that conversation. So the conversational model looks like this. You'll see on the screen there two triangles, a red triangle and the blue triangle. Let's just say those two triangles represent two people, okay? The red person and the blue person. And those two people have come together to address a shared issue, an issue about which they need to make some decision, reach some level of agreement. Now, at the top of each triangle, you see P1 and P2. P stands for position. And in this model, what it says is that when you and I come together to engage in shared problem solving, we typically come to the conversation with our position as it relates to the issue. And this is the issue, and I'm going, if I'm the red triangle, I go, okay, and we'll just say Rob's the blue triangle. I sit down with Rob and say, well, Rob, I've been thinking about this issue, and this is how I understand, this is what I see as the problem, and this is what I think we should do. So typically my position includes, my analysis of the issue and my proposed solution, what we should do. Now we'll say Rob is the blue triangle, and Rob could come back, and you could come back in one of two ways potentially. He could say, that's amazing, Greg. That's exactly what I think. I mean, we've drawn the same conclusions. Now, if that's the case, our positions are compatible, and we basically say, great, let's do that. End of conversation, we'd go forth and pursue that level of agreement. But where conflict exists, or where conflict shows up, is where my position and Rob's position are perceived as incompatible. So in this case, Rob comes back and goes, whoa, time out, Greg. I don't think that's going to work. That's not a good idea, and let me tell you why. And he will tell me why my idea is not a good idea. he'll say, I've been thinking about it, and here's what I think we should do. And so he'll tell me his what. Now that's the definition of conflict. Conflict has been defined as two or more people who interact. In this case, Rob and I are talking to each other, and in the context of that interaction, one or both of us perceive some level of incompatible difference or threat. Rob's solution, Rob's idea is incompatible with mine and vice versa. My position somehow threatens Rob. Now, it doesn't necessarily threaten him physically, but he says, if we do what you're suggesting, that does not work for me. So what we typically do is we engage in a telling conversation. We try to convince each other why the other is wrong and why we're right. And that's traditional sort of distributive negotiation, they call it, where we're arguing back and forth. Now, one of us could win the argument, the other could lose, vice versa, for a whole host of reasons. Or the best that we might achieve is that we would reach a compromise. So, Rob gives a little, I give a little, and we find, what we would say, some middle ground here. So here's where this becomes interesting. What Fisher and Urey posited in their book, Getting to Yes, is that when Rob and I take positions on issues, those positions are driven by our underlying interests. So whereas our position represents what we want, the interests are why that's important to us. So the interests become our underlying values, our objectives, our needs as to what we're trying to accomplish as it relates to this shared issue. Now, we want to restructure the conversation at this point from a telling conversation to a learning conversation. So rather than telling Rob why his position is, no offense, Rob, stupid, makes no sense, is not going to work, I'm going to ask Rob, tell me more about that. What's important to you about that? What leads you to the conclusion that that makes sense here? What do I need to understand about your point of view that maybe I don't currently understand? We need to move to our underlying interests. And again, the way you do that is you ask questions. If you primarily want to understand what a mediator does, a mediator steps into a conversation that's gotten stuck between the two positions and restructures it by asking questions to get to the underlying interests, okay? Now, when Rob and I go that direction, when we begin engaging in inquiry, and the term is we're balancing advocacy with inquiry, I'm advocating what's important to me, and I'm inquiring in what's important to Rob. And he's doing the same thing. He's shifted from, I need to just focus on what I need. He's going, no, let's come together. And I'm going to focus on what I need, but I also want to understand what Greg needs here. And if we can understand that, we can maybe come up with a plan that'll work for both of us. And so when we do that, we find, hey, there's things we agree on. Now, it's interesting, if you get stuck too long arguing at this level, you begin to think there's nothing we agree on. And I've been a mediator for 30 years, and I haven't found a case where people agreed on certain things. So we will find things about which we agree, and we will find things where we have independent interests. In other words, I have an interest over here around this issue that Rob doesn't share. Now, Rob doesn't say, because I don't share it, I don't think it's important. He would go, yeah, I get that's important to you. It's just not high priority for me. And Rob will have interests that I don't share, okay? And so I don't say, well, if I don't share, it's not important. I go, no, I get it. That's important to you. Yeah, but it's just not important to me. The point is, we want to have a conversation that uncovers our common and our independent interests. Let me say it again. We want to have a conversation that unpacks, identifies, clarifies our underlying common and independent interests. And we also want to find those areas where we're not going to agree at this point. Okay, so what does that sound like? Well, it sounds like creating a deeper shared pool of understanding. See, we have a very shallow understanding, if you want to use the water pool metaphor right here. We have a deeper understanding here. And those interests, and this is the important piece, the interests become the criteria by which you're going to generate options. Right now, my option and Ron and Rob's options are the only ones. We want to say, based on what we know now, what could we do? What are some options that we hadn't even thought about? And it's out of those deeper pools of understanding that innovation, creativity is born as we begin to move forward, okay? And we can move that to a solution. So let me just back up and share a couple of examples. I'm going to share a special ed example, and I'm going to share a personal example. So a number of years ago, I got a call from a parent advocate saying, we want to go to mediation. I'm going, okay, what's the issue? Okay. And the issue was paraeducator time, IA time. The position of the parent was, we want the district to provide a full-time one-on-one paraeducator for our child. Okay, you've heard this before. What was the position of the district? Nope, we don't think he needs it. Okay. So are those positions incompatible? Yes. Okay. What's the issue about which they are in disagreement? Paraeducator time, instructional aid time. That's the presenting issue. Okay. So right now we understand, we have a level of understanding of what the issue is, and we have two positions on that issue, which are incompatible. So in the conversation, I said, yeah, we would mediate that. I just said, though, I'm curious, what would be different in the child's program if he had a full-time instructional aid or a full-time para? Now, by asking that question, I'm moving from what to why. What are you asking for? Why are you asking for it? What would be different? What is your interest in increasing, this resource for the child? We went back and forth a couple of times, and finally the advocate said, well, here's the deal. This is a little boy who has some significant social, emotional, behavioral issues. The IEP team has designed a behavior intervention plan for him that everybody agrees on. And it's one of those plans you may be familiar with, which is a full, we call it sort of wraparound plan, in which every adult in this little boy's school is part of the plan. It's not just a plan in the classroom, it's a plan for the school, because this little boy gets around. And so it's a plan that involves the teacher, the other grade level teachers, the paraeducator staff, the counselor, the learning specialist, the school psychologist, the office manager, the principal, the attendance secretary, the lunchroom aide, the playground aide, the custodian. All those adults are in on the plan to help this little boy be successful. And she goes, the only way that we think that the school can successfully implement a complex plan like that is that they really need to hire a full-time instructional aide paraeducator to manage the plan. And I go, great, thank you, that's really helpful. And I said, I think you're trying to solve the wrong problem. And she goes, what do you mean? I said, well, the problem isn't, do we or do we not hire a paraeducator full-time? The problem is, how do we successfully implement this behavior intervention plan? Now just stop there for a moment and listen to that. Those are two very different questions, defining the nature of the challenge, okay? Do we hire a full-time paraeducator? How do we successfully implement this plan? The question you ask will focus your attention in the conversation. She goes, what do you mean? I said, well, why don't you go back to the team and determine what is it going to take, to implement this plan successfully for this particular student? And then determine, if, for example, if the school's done this before, it might be a little more straightforward. I said, then determine where you might need additional resources, what you might have available to you, and then go from there. She said, well, I hadn't thought about that. And she hung up and I never heard from her again. Now, what I like about this model are a number of things. One, it really focuses on identifying the criteria that you and I are going to use to determine what a wise decision is. The authors use that term. What's a wise decision? A wise decision is one that doesn't prove me right and you wrong. A wise decision maximizes our ability to meet our objectives, both individually and collectively. Okay. And so the other thing I like about this is that it really helps us to hone in on what is the problem we're trying to solve. We spend a tremendous amount of time, generating solutions to problems or challenges that we haven't taken time to really fully understand. And so stepping back and saying, are we asking the right question? Often the questions we ask are, how do we solve the problem? And yet there's a whole model that says, well, if we keep asking questions about how to solve the problem, our whole conversation will focus on the problem. If we ask questions, on the other hand, as to what's our objective, what are we trying to accomplish, that's a whole different focused conversation, okay? And there are models out there around talking about structuring, the conversation by the questions we ask, okay? And one author says, if you focus on the problem, you're going to be stuck in the problem. If you focus on the outcome, it's about moving forward and leaving the problem behind and figuring out how do we begin to leverage what we do have to apply it to this thing we want to create moving forward. As an aside, I would submit, you could have hired a full-time paraeducator for this little boy, and it could have had negative consequences, because maybe we want this little child to develop some independence. Well, now he's not independent. He's very dependent on this person. Maybe as a staff, we're all committed to this little guy's success, and he's no longer our problem. He's just that person's problem. So that's one way of thinking about this. The other example I'll give, which you might find helpful in your own personal life, is, I'll make it fairly quick. My wife and I used to have an annual negotiation. And the negotiation would typically be, what are we going to do for vacation this summer? Okay. My wife and I are both educators. And so our vacation time was pretty much focused on, July, early August. And so we would often start the conversation by the question, what are we going to do for vacation this summer? And we would often come to the conversation with suggestions. One of us would come to the conversation going, well, I think we should go car camping for 2 weeks. Yeah, let's load the tent and everything in the car, head off across the country and go car camping for 2 weeks. And the other person, so that's a position or suggestion. The other person goes, are you kidding? That is not a vacation. We're not doing that. Let's go hang out at the beach for 2 weeks and just do nothing. That would be a great vacation. The other person goes, that's got to be the most boring idea I've ever heard, okay? Now we have two positions. Are we going to go car camping? Are we going to go hang out at the beach and do nothing? What are we going to do? Now, based on the question, we in essence have two positions. And if each of us really likes our position, we're going to start pushing towards, I think we should go car camping, which actually is my wife's idea, not mine. I think we should go to the beach. That's my idea. But we actually changed the question recently. And a number of years ago, we were having this conversation. We said, we don't like any of the suggestions we've got on the table. So let's ask a different question. And the question we asked is not, the question was not, what do you want to do for vacation? The question is, what do we need in a vacation this year? Now, by asking the question need, we're getting to what are the interests that you and I are trying to meet around this thing we call vacation? So we actually had a series of conversations where we identified, our interests. We talked about length of time. We talked about quality of experience. We talked about, wanting to really be far away from our current day so that we couldn't, I couldn't call my office and we couldn't connect. We wanted to really separate ourselves. We wanted to do something, sort of out of the ordinary, not something that we would typically do. And so we had a whole number of common interests, and we had some independent interests. I had some things that I was hoping to accomplish, and my wife had things that she would like to see in a vacation. But we basically spent time unpacking that and identifying what those interests are. And in essence, those interests are the criteria by which we're saying a good vacation will include those objectives. A good vacation will create those opportunities, okay? So then once we got the interest, the question became, how do we design a vacation to meet those objectives, okay? And so we looked at, and we even took the list and said, what's our top 5? We can't meet every objective. What's most important to us? So it became a very focused, targeted decision-making process based on a strong awareness of what our underlying objectives are. We often go into difficult conversations or negotiating knowing what we want, but not why. I cannot tell you how many people have gone into a negotiation or have mediated with who are arguing for something, but they really don't know why they're arguing for it. And in fact, sometimes they're arguing for objectives that may be counterproductive to what their underlying interests are. And it's only way you get to those underlying interests is to identify the questions that will begin to unpack those. And so when we come together as a team, how do we ask each other questions that will unpack those underlying interests? All right, just a quick check there. Once we have the options, we then take those options and say, which option makes most sense for us? Which option are we going to pursue going forward? What are we going to do? Okay. I have negotiated so many things. I've negotiated the purchase of a car with my daughter at one point in life. I've negotiated, I mean, it's just a model that has a whole lot of sense in a lot of context. And so you don't have to wait to a special ed meeting or conversation to apply this model. My guess is you could probably apply this model someplace within the next 24 hours if it makes sense to you. So, okay. So the point here is, what's the common theme? Is there a common theme that runs through everything I've talked about so forward? And given that we're not in a joint session, I'll answer the question, but just think about it. Is there a common theme? The common theme for me is curiosity. It's all about curiosity. You're shifting from a telling stance to a learning stance. It's all about shifting from judgment and fear to curiosity and compassion. It's about structuring conversations that facilitate curiosity. It's about being curious about, why do people think the way they think? Why do people take the positions they've taken? But what do I need to understand about you that I don't understand? You know, one thing I've learned as a conflict engagement professional is that almost all conflict is not about what you think it's about. And so when I'm teaching in the area of conflict engagement, people often say, well, you know, give me some really quick tips. How could I get better at navigating engaging conflict? And I'll say, if you want 2 tips, here they are. 1, be conscious of what you do when you find yourself in conflict. So in other words, go back to that choice point. What do I do? How often do I find myself going to defend? Is that where I want to be? Is that going to produce the outcome that is going to be beneficial for both of us, and in our case, for the child that we're working together to serve? Or can I suspend judgment and stay curious and say, you know, I don't know what I think about what you're saying, but I want to hear more. Okay. And so suspending judgment. So it's about being cognizant of how you show up in those conflicts and increasing your capacity for curiosity. Increasing your capacity for curiosity. Now, what facilitates curiosity? Shared learning, the questions that we ask. Okay. So just checking in, Rob, any questions or feedback at this point? I'm seeing no questions at this point, but anything anybody wants to query about?
I put in a question.
Joanne?
How can parties move from the defend position to the suspend position? In other words, if they're in a meeting and they're talking about a child and they recognize that the other side is in a telling stance, what can they say to try to encourage that other party to move to a stance where they might be willing to listen and be more productive?
Yeah, great question, Joanne. So there's 2 things. When I find someone else taking a telling stance, I have a choice. I can engage in a responsive telling stance, which will typically end up being a debate. Or I can say, I'm going to model a learning stance. You know, Joanne's in a telling stance because there's something she wants me to understand. And so I need to understand it before she's going to, you know, step away from that. And so I need to stay strongly engaged on a learning stance and say, let's, Joanne, am I understanding where you're coming from? Now, Joanne may say, you don't get it. I would say, so Joanne, what do I need to get? What do you want me to understand that I don't understand? And I would finally respond to you, Joanne, and say, do I understand it? And you might say, yeah, I actually think you are, because in fact, I'm not arguing with her. You know, she's expecting that I'm going to respond in an argumentative way or defensive way, in a telling way. I'm going, I'm not going there. I really want to understand. And then I would say, so Joanne, I don't want to debate what you're saying. I want to add to what you're saying. Would you be willing to hear my perspective? Again, I'm not here to negate or to rebut what you said. Would you be willing to hear my perspective? And more likely than not, I'm going to shift Joanne's stance to the conversation by the way I engage in that particular context. The other way I would put it out there, Joanne, is I think in many difficult conversations, and I teach this in a lot of the classes I teach, which you're aware of, is that we sometimes need to have a conversation about how we're going to have the conversation before we have the conversation. So if I'm going to sit down with you and I recognize that the conversation we're going to have is going to be around some issues that have divided us and around which have strongly held differences of opinion, I'd say, let's talk about how we're going to have this conversation. I might say in the past, we found ourselves arguing who's right or wrong. And I said, I just don't want to have that conversation. It's not moving us where we need to go. I'd like to have a conversation that invites shared learning. And so we would create some shared expectations about how to have a different conversation. And the last thing I would say is that whenever I'm entering into a conversation, I have two fundamental questions that I ask myself. Who is this conversation calling me to be? Am I being called to make a decision? Am I being called to make a shared decision with you? Am I being called to advise? Who am I called to be here? And then who am I committed to being in this conversation? I'm not particularly committed to being right. I'm committed to making wise decisions in service of these children. So if that's what I'm committed to, how would I show up? So it's a long answer to your question, Joanne. One, it's in the choices we make. So it's in the choices we make and how to respond to that telling stance. And it's not responding defensively, it's responding openly and curiously about what's this person want me to understand? It's about being clear on who do I want to be in this conversation and not getting sucked into an argument debate that in the long run is not going to be productive. So let me stop there. Is that helpful, Joanne?
That was very helpful.
Thanks. All right. So again, curiosity. Tattoo it on your forehead or something. I don't know. So I'm going to share these kind of funky little diagrams. They come from a book called The Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision Making. And what they are is they're sort of graphic illustrations of conversations of people working together, okay? And sort of what we think those conversations look like. And then we're going to move into specific questions. So this is a conversation, this is a model for how we think conversations work. We start on the left here with an issue, some topic we want to solve, and we talk to each other, and that's you and I and other people talking to each other. And somehow magically at the end, we end up with a decision. Now, how it happens, I don't know, but we got a decision. Wasn't that cool? You know, we sort of hope that have a topic, have a conversation, reach a decision, okay? Not always the case. Does it happen sometimes? Sure, in easy, simple things. This is what often happens in conversations. We start with the conversation, we have the conversation, we're having the conversation, and at some point we go, I have no idea what we're talking about anymore. I don't know where we are. What are you talking about? I'm talking about this. And so the conversation becomes very chaotic and unfocused, and we kind of just go throw up our hands and going, well, I don't know what to do. Okay. So there's that kind of a conversation. And I don't know about you, I've been in lots of meetings like that and conversations where I'm going, I have no idea what we're talking about here. This is an interesting structure that says, particularly around difficult conversations, we agree to have the conversation, i.e. with the new topic there, but, and this is more often than not implicit rather than explicit, we are only willing to have the conversation within our comfort zone. Okay, we're only willing to have the conversation where we don't feel threatened, where people don't feel uncomfortable, where people, are feeling like, okay, I'm very comfortable with this conversation. Now, within our comfort zone is fundamentally things we all already know. What's outside our comfort zone? What we don't know, what's available that we're unwilling to explore. But often we get stuck in that space. I was working with a client a number of years ago. It was an elementary school staff, and the principal was a good friend of mine. And he said, I need you to come in and facilitate our conversation. And I go, okay, I can. And I asked him, what do you need in a facilitator? He said, we've been Maytagging for 2 years. And I go, Maytagging, what's that? He said, we're stuck in the spin cycle and we can't get out. Now, I started laughing when I heard that, because he basically said, we've had this conversation for 2 years within our comfort zone. And there's no new learning in there, but we're afraid to step outside of our comfort zone. We're afraid to push the conversation out into unknown territory because we don't know what's out there. We don't know if we feel safe enough in order to explore that, which is often why you would hire a facilitator or mediator to structure the conversation and invite you out into that new territory. That new territory is where all new learning occurs, okay? And so how do we create contexts that will facilitate our ability to explore that new territory collectively? And this is, he calls this leading through distress, but basically he said, we start with a conversation on the left, new topic. We recognize our propensity to want to stay in our comfort zone. However, we are agreeing that we're going to push the limits of our conversation. We're going to go out into the unknown. And maybe we'll hire a facilitator or a mediator. Maybe we just agree that we're going to have a conversation where we're going to push the envelope in the conversation. And so we engage in what the authors would call divergent thinking. We're diverging from what we know to create a deeper knowing, deeper pool of understanding. Now, in some conversations, if you look at this middle point, you get so far out there, you're going, whoa, this is a tough problem. This is a complex problem. We have new information and we still have questions. In fact, we have questions we didn't know we had. Now, the authors of this particular model call this the groan zone. And the groan zone is where you're going, whoa, this is bigger than we thought. And you have to be careful, because if you get stuck in here too long, you'll throw up your hands and go, can't do it. So there's a point where you need to go into this zone and say, okay, do we know more here than we knew here? Oh, absolutely. Do we still have questions? Yes. However, we can't answer all those questions. So let's take what we know and let's begin to identify, are there some actions we could take? So in that point, we're moving from convergent thinking to, divergent thinking to convergent thinking. And at some point, we're going to take action and we'll loop back and start the process over again of shared learning. And that's in many cases what happens in an IEP process. We learned a lot, we still have questions, and yet we can't stop to answer all the questions. We are going to make decisions for the coming year. We're going to take these actions. In implementing those actions, we're going to increase new learning going forward. Okay. So that begins to lay the context for now getting into the specificity of questions and the role of questions. So I've tried to explain the questions are used in the context of conversations. Questions are the most powerful influencer of the structure of the conversation. And to the extent that the purpose of the conversation is shared learning, deepened learning, then questions are going to be very significant, play a significant role, be significant tools in the context of that. So let's just take the remaining time here and begin to focus on more specifically the idea of questions and the power of questions. And you may be aware, it's not just what we ask, it's also how we ask it that's important, okay? When I was younger, my father would often ask me a question, Greg, why did you do that? Now, when he asked that question in that way, I was pretty certain I'd done something stupid, something that he found unacceptable, and that his question was really less of a question and more of a judgment, okay? However, you could say, Greg, I'm kind of curious why you chose to do that. The way I said that question, the tone of voice, the intonation, created a different sense. The first question communicated judgment. The second question communicated to me some level of curiosity, okay? So being conscious of asking the question, but also asking the question in alignment with open to learning, open to curiosity. Questions influence the way we tell our stories, what we share, what we don't share, what we include, what we don't include. Questions open doors that people are sometimes unwilling or afraid to open, or even unaware need to be opened. So this idea that questions expand our thinking. The very act of asking a question can have a profound influence. And I'm hunching that there are times in your life where maybe someone at a point in your life asked you a question. And that question and the engagement of that question was a significant influencer on how you moved forward. And in fact, you could say, in some cases, that question changed my life because it opened up areas of exploration and thought that I'd never explored. I was reading one article where the author referred to a good question as a brain irritant, which I thought that was kind of funny. In my job pre-COVID, I spent quite a bit of my time in my car driving various locations, and I tend to listen to the radio and talk shows. And I'll hear a question and go, dang, that's a great question. And for the next 50 miles, I'm thinking about that question. That question has planted itself in my brain. And what is it doing? It's doing work. It's doing work. It's engaging my brain in the issue at the heart of that question and exploration on my part. Okay. So questions have the power to shape meaning, how we understand things, to open possibilities, to restrict possibilities. They're just so incredibly pivotal. So when we talk about asking questions, we talk about this term of intentional inquiry, that I'm asking questions with purpose in mind. So going back to the idea of a tool, when I have a job to do, I'm going to choose the tool to do the work I need to do. If I'm gardening and I need to move 10 yards of mulch, I'm not going to use a trowel. I'm going to use a big scoop shovel and a wheelbarrow. If we're planting bulbs, I'm going to use a small trowel. If I'm trimming the grass, I'll choose something else. If I'm replanting whatever, I'm going to pick the tool for the job. Okay. So intentional inquiry is a method of asking questions with purpose in mind. Now, in our context, when I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity, I used to do some work for the courts. And so I would often be part of a trial and would be cross-examined around the work that I did for the courts. And attorneys ask very specific intentional questions. They ask intentional questions to which they already know the answer. They're not looking for new information. They're looking for accessing information that they want for building their case, okay? So they are asking questions very intentionally for that purpose. The purpose I really want to invite us to is in asking questions whose purpose is curiosity. Questions to which we do not already have the answer. Questions around which we're truly, genuinely curious for looking for the answer. Asking questions that inspire reflection and new thinking. I like to ask questions that not only do I not know the answer to, you might not know the answer to. And that by asking that question of you, it serves to facilitate your deeper thinking, your deeper focus, your deeper reflection. It often helps you to reflect on, yeah, this is what I'm saying I want. Why do I want that? I don't know. Well, let's explore that. Okay, because it's going to be really beneficial if you and I can jointly understand the whys of what we're thinking so that we can work together to achieve that. It often invites us to step away from what we call a very stuck or narrow understanding, a very stuck or narrow story, and saying, what else could be going on here? There's a 2-question sequence that I love to ask. What are you making that mean? So somebody says something and someone takes offense at what they said because they feel like the person's intent was to offend them. And the question is, well, what else could it mean? Well, I don't know. Well, could it mean something else? Well, it could mean this. Okay. So again, inviting them to get out of this idea, you're here to prove me wrong, to no, you asked me that question. You said that not in order to make me feel stupid, because you really wanted to know. Okay. So really being focused on getting out of those stuck conversations. So here we get now to really the heart of this, and not the heart of it, but really get to the specifics, and that's in crafting intentional questions. And what I'm going to introduce you to is a basic toolbox of questions, okay? This is not in any way, shape, or form meant to be an exhaustive list of questions, but it's a basic toolbox of questions. When I was younger, my dad built for both my brother and I these beautiful handmade toolboxes. And in the toolboxes, there were a selection of tools, a couple saws and a number of screwdrivers and a couple wrenches and, just basic tools to get started. Now, over the years, since I was a child, I've done construction, I've built houses, I have a much larger collection of tools. And so I want to give you a basic toolbox in which to begin thinking about tools as questions, or questions as tools for moving forward. And so in these 7 categories of questions, they are not single questions, they are types of questions. So like there's not a single screwdriver, there's a ton of different screwdrivers. There's not a single wrench, there's all kinds of wrenches. And that's the way these questions work. So I'm going to go through these and explain to you sort of the difference between these. And then I'm going to ask you to maybe get a piece of paper and a pencil, because I'm going to give you a little 2 or 3 minute activity here to do, okay? And you'll see that these questions in some ways are sequential in the way they flow. So the first question is a broadening question. A broadening question is designed to be very non-directive and to give the person to whom you're asking the question broad response options. It's designed to be very non-threatening. So a broadening question would be like, tell me what happened. The person can go as much or as deep or far as what they want to share. Tell me tell me why you're here. Now, I work with people within the Part C, the birth to 3 system. And one of the first questions I'll often ask families is, tell me about a day in the life of your child. So it's really broad. It allows the person who's being asked the question to share as much or as little. Okay, what happened next would be a broadening question. I always think of these as scoop shovels, just like get more information on the table. A second kind of a question is a clarifying question. And a clarifying question does what it says. It's designed to clarify a word or a term, the intent of what someone was saying. So if you were, as a parent came to me, said, I'm really concerned about my child's safety in that classroom, what's a clarifying question I would ask? What do you mean by safety? Are we talking about physical safety? Are we talking about emotional safety? Are we talking about bullying? Are we talking about peanut allergies? I don't know. I'm not being treated with respect. What do you mean by respect? They never. What do you mean by never? They always. What do you mean by always? So clarifying is designed to take a word or a concept and say, I think I know what this means, but I'm not sure if I know what you mean by this. And rather than going forward and saying, oh yeah, I know what they mean. No, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by safety? An explaining question is a question that invites the person to explain to you how they reached a certain conclusion, how they got from point A to point B. Explain to me why you believe we should increase speech and language services for your child. You're saying the statement is you need to increase speech and language services by 30 minutes a week. Explain to me how you got there, okay? Explain to me why you believe it's essential your child be served in his or her neighborhood school, okay? Explain to me why you want to make sure your child stays in the general ed curriculum for science or music. Explain to me your thinking, because your outcome doesn't make sense to me, but if I understand the thinking that got you there, it takes on different meaning. An exploring question is a question designed to really get to the underlying interest. What's most important to you about having your child served in his or her neighborhood school? What's most important to you about having your child stay in general ed classroom for science? One of my favorite questions is, what do you most want me to understand that maybe I don't currently understand, or you're not sure if I understand? So an exploring question is where you're really deeply, help me understand, how would a full-time paraeducator, what would that change for this child's program? What would be different? That's where I'm trying to get to those underlying interests, okay? Challenging questions are questions designed to confront what appears to be sort of, what's the word I want to use, dissonance in what someone's saying. They're saying things that seem to not fit together. I was doing a mediation where the parent was asking for a full-time one-on-one paraeducator for a high school student and asking for the school to really focus on this young man's social independence. And the district's going, how does focusing on social independence connect with this full-time, sort of adult shadow? And so we had to ask it, help me understand how this fits with this. I don't see the connection. Could you help me understand? So it's confronting in a respectful, curious way. It's not saying that doesn't make sense. It's saying, help me understand. Brainstorming questions.
Greg, this is Joanne.
Yeah,
Could
Joanne.
you also kind of switch it? So how would a parent ask those questions if they were going into a school with a positional demand on the parent? Like, we want to move your child's placement, or we're taking away the para, or how could those questions be framed from the parent's perspective?
Sure. So let's take a look at that. So district, you're considering moving my child to a much more restrictive placement in a different school. Help me understand how that's going to fit with his real difficulty with transition. Or my son has some social emotional needs and he's made some significant connections with both staff and peers at his school. How is changing him to a whole new school and a new program, how is that going to address the social emotional gains he's made? Does that make sense, Joanne?
Yes, it does. I just know there's people on here that would like to hear it, because while there's a lot about schools asking questions from the parents' demand, parents often report they go into meetings and they're hit with positional demands from the school district. We're going to change this, or we're going to do this. And I think people aren't sure what kind of questions to ask. You know, like why did you make this decision? How is that going to support my child's education? I mean, how can they ask some examples? I was just trying to look at the other side too.
Well, I totally appreciate that, Joanne. And my goal would be, as parents, you're asking those questions. So in an IEP meeting, if there's something you don't understand that doesn't make sense, my invitation is don't sit and go, well, maybe they know what they're doing, saying, help me understand. I'm not quite sure what leads you to believe that we should be making this program in your child. I mean, really help me understand why. Help me understand. I'm not making a connection. This doesn't, if something doesn't make sense to me, say it. You know, it's not like this doesn't make sense to me. It's like, I'm having trouble making sense of this. Could you explain to me the rationale behind that? You are a member of the team. You have every right to understand the reasoning and thinking process of that team as any other team member. And so how do you ask those questions? Again, not out of judgment, out of curiosity. I'm not getting where we're going here. Can we slow this down? And yes, in some cases, it's going to slow things down, but sometimes you got to slow down in order to go faster, we often say, which means you got to ask those questions. And I know it's challenging as a parent going in there because there's often a lot of them and there's one or two of us. And so even going in advance, what are the questions I'm going to want to ask? Because in the moment, it sounds like I'm like overwhelmed. I don't know what's going on. What are the questions? Part of going into that meeting is, what are the questions that I need answered prior to going in? Which means I need to have seen the IEP prior to the meeting. And if there's questions that I have about the IEP, both the what and the why, I need to write those questions down and say, in this conversation, these are questions that I'm going to want to have addressed. In fact, they've even had parents say, send your questions in advance so the team's ready to answer. So it's just part of that sharing of that agenda. Does that begin to communicate what you're looking for, Joanne?
Yes, it did.
Which is why I think as parents, we sometimes need to meet with each other, not with advocates necessarily, but with other parents who can partner with us to help us think strategically about how to do that. We've implemented some programs in our state called parent partners. They're not parent advocates, they're parent partners who will sit down with you and say, let me help you prepare for your IEP meeting. What are the questions you have? What do you understand? What don't you understand? How could you ask that question? Let's write that question down. So I think that's a resource that we see a huge need for in our state, that we're focusing a lot of energy in trying to create that resource, not to speak for you, but to prepare you to engage as a fully operating member of the IEP team. The last question is a reality testing or consequential questions, which are questions that say, what's going to be the impact of this? How, if you're talking about changing my son's placement, how is he going to respond to that? How is he going to deal with that transition? You know, if we're talking about making a significant change in the IEP, how is this going to affect such and such? How is this going to impact so and so? You know, if I was going to move my child, your child out of the neighborhood school, how is he going to deal with the increased transportation that's going to be required moving from his neighborhood to school to some other school across the district? So what I would like you to do is just take about 3 minutes, if you would, please, 3 or 4 minutes, and then I'm going to hand it back to Rob. And I want you to just write down, as you've heard these questions, just write down some examples of questions that you might want to ask your child's teacher, your child's IEP team, a particular staff member, just write down some examples, 3 or 4 questions that you might want to pose when you were gathering. We'll take about 3 minutes for that, and then I'll open it up and give it back to Rob and Joanne to see if we have any questions. Take about 1 more minute. Okay. I hope you found some value in that. And if you've got some questions about questions, we can maybe look at them now. But let me turn it back to Rob or Joanne, whoever wants to pick up at this point, and maybe facilitate answering any questions or sort of a wrap up here.
Okay, I was putting something in to everyone. I wanted you to know that you can go to our website, which is www.okcirc.org. You hover over program services, and then you go to stakeholder training, and you look at our modules, and it's module 5. And Greg wrote that for us. And he spends there's a whole module that really dives deeper into questions. And this is such an important topic that Greg is talking to us about today, because sometimes I think we get in there and we're angry, or just maybe emotional, and just don't know where to go with the questions we need to ask. And so it's really, really an important thing to work on and to look at the purpose of your question. I know the first time that Greg did this training for our mediators, he asked a question: what is your favorite question? What question do you have, and what is the purpose of that question? And I recognize that when I do intakes on the phone, when I've heard everything I feel like I need to say, I'll then ask the question, what is it that you need from me? And the purpose of that question is to move the conversation somewhere else. And so there are questions that you ask. And just to add on what Greg has said to us today, think about the questions you do typically ask when you go into meetings. And how open you are. Sometimes people will share with me they're really afraid to ask questions. And these are schools that I'm thinking of, because they're afraid of what the parent might answer. And I don't think you need to be afraid. I think you have to come to that place of learning to try to understand where that person is coming from. And it really helps you come up with a way of feeling like you're really engaged with that person and understanding. And if you don't have the answer, maybe you can say, that's a great question. And we need some time to really think through that and meet again to discuss it. So there's no time that you should be afraid. It's okay. I have to say, when I first started teaching and I was in a fourth grade classroom, that was my biggest fear, is would those fourth graders ask me a question that I didn't know how to answer? Now, I was 27 at the time. And actually, I learned it didn't matter. I could say, well, I don't know, let's look that up. And so it's the same here, that you just need to become more comfortable with trying to find out where everybody's issues and motives and their purposes are coming from, and that you'll understand better.
I would add to that, Joanne, I think there's nothing wrong in a meeting to sending in advance. Here's some questions that I would really like to address in our meeting, so people don't feel like they're getting blindsided. And please be ready to come and respond to these, not because I'm trying to get you somehow, but these are some things that I'm looking for, which gives people a chance to prepare. So
yeah. And because, and I do think it's true that in the IEP meetings, I experienced this as a teacher, and then I experienced it differently as a parent. But if you're a teacher in a school building, you know everything about that child. You know how they behave in class, you know who they pass notes to, you know who they play with, who they eat lunch with. You just know all that, and you just take it for granted. But that parent coming in knows absolutely nothing about what happens with that child. And sometimes it's just an extra bit of time to try to explain how that child is functioning and why you think it would be helpful and why this is needed. So, well, I'm not seeing any questions in the question and answer. I put mine in the chat because I couldn't do it in the question and answer. It wouldn't let me.
There is one here. There's one question. And I also wanted to just let you know that I put the YouTube link to module 5 in the chat. So people can go to our website, but they don't have to. It's there. I just didn't want to do it while Greg was talking in case something happened.
Okay. And that module, the YouTube, is the part of Greg talking, but it's not the paperwork.
Okay.
So they'll have to go get the paperwork. There's written materials too. Okay. And Jennifer shared with us, she always asks parents to put their comments and concerns in writing in advance. So if they are not answered, they will provide it in a written notice in lieu of what the parent asks.
absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to encourage parents, even though they're emotional, just to write down some of the questions without the emotions. I think the whole part about the suspend judgment or defend, what that is about to me is just your demeanor and your attitude about whether you're going to go in and be in a telling stance or a learning stance. So you want to make sure that those concerns that parent is asking, if you can help them to stay in that learning stance. Yeah.
Joanne, you asked the question, how to move parties from defend positions to suspend positions. And a lot of that has to do with how do you start the conversation? You're aware of crucial conversations. One of the skills they talk about is contrasting. In this conversation, I'm not here to argue with you, debate with you, determine who's right or wrong. I am here to talk with you in a way that you and I can learn from each other, and we make a decision that's mutually beneficial to your child. And so, just that simple way of convening the conversation. I don't want to argue. I don't want to debate. It's not about who's right or wrong. That's not a useful conversation. It's about let's learn together. So
yeah, that's an excellent way to handle it right there. It's great.
Well, thank
Well,
you.
Greg, we want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us, and you just have such a nice demeanor and a lot of experience in your background to share with us, and we really appreciate it. Next month, we will be meeting again for our very last Wednesday, Wisdom Wednesdays, and Andrea Kunkel will be sharing with us her perspectives from being a school district attorney to the director of the Oklahoma Directors of Special Services, their attorney, and to share with us what she sees as strengths and maybe some weaknesses within our system and how we could work on those things together. So I'd like to thank Greg again. We appreciate him so much. And thank you for joining us today. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody, and goodbye from the Pacific Northwest.
Thank you.